Thank you very much, and good afternoon. It's great joy I have to see so many people dedicated to studying mental health issues, and I'm very appreciative that the Judicial Summit decided to take this half hour. It's just a half hour, so I've got my watch there. I'll make sure I stick to that. To do sort of the inverse, to look at all of us who are in the courts and see how we can ourselves deal with the effects of hearing trauma, repeated traumatic events in our courtrooms. How can we actually exercise self-care, and what's going on in our courtrooms with ourselves. So it's kind of a reverse look. It's sort of at our mental health versus the mental health of the defendants. But I want to end in the final 10 minutes about how this can actually work inside the courtroom to be better judges, lawyers, everyone working with all of these issues in our courtrooms. Is that doing? Yes. We know that in terms of mental health, if you look at the picture of lawyers, it's not a pretty one. And lawyers have probably been the most studied when you look at, besides first responders, at the effects of trauma. About 48%, according to this recent ABA study, 46% are suffering from depression, a high number suffering from anxiety, 11% report suicidal thoughts. It's not a pretty picture. Just recently, I saw a study in which lawyers who work with child abuse cases have a much higher percentage of suffering from secondary trauma than even first responders that deal with these cases. The younger the lawyer is, the greater the problem in terms of substance abuse, depression, and anxiety. And law schools actually right now are trying to deal with this issue. You go to law school, I think every law school in Texas, when you show up there, they devote a whole day on some of the things I'm going to mention today, such as mindfulness and dealing with stress. Now, like this half-hour talk, like any talk, if you don't actually put into daily practice some means of dealing with your day-to-day existence in law school, it probably won't have any effect. It's good that they're doing this, but there's definitely a problem, and they're recognizing that problem as well. Well, what about people in court? What studies are there of us in court? Those who work day-to-day in court and see, often in a secondary way, traumatic events and hear about traumatic events. Well, we don't have many studies. There are several. Probably the best one was conducted by the National Judicial College, in which they found that about 62% of judges, especially those with more experience, suffer from secondary trauma. Now let me skip here. What is secondary trauma? Secondary trauma is trauma resulting from caring for, hearing about, or witnessing the intense suffering of others. Over time, the cumulative effect can result in internalization of trauma, leading to compassion fatigue or burnout. And if you don't like the word secondary trauma, it seems compassion fatigue is the current word that a lot of people like to use. But it's very, it's sizable, it exists. More and more now, I think people are going to start looking at judges. I'll go into why we don't have a lot on judges and why judges often are the last ones to deal with this problem. But I thought it would be, really beneficial just to hear what the judges at this National Judicial College had to write after being surveyed and demonstrating symptoms of secondary trauma. Because I think it kind of illustrates the problem that a lot of us have. Many judges suggested focusing on facts and legal issues at hand instead of the gruesome details. Another recommended that when typing notes during testimony, focus on grammar and words, not the meaning and pain behind those words. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I don't play one on TV. I don't, but obviously, that would be like during this conference, every 5 minutes counting the light bulbs. It's not something necessarily that correlates with understanding what really is going on at the present moment in the courtroom. One judge said he or she avoids reading any deeper into petitions for protections from child abuse than is necessary for the allegations to meet the requirements for protection. Others, and I like this, mention coping mechanisms such as biking home from work, hiking, yoga, reading, and mindfulness. However, numerous judges were dismissive of the malady. One said judges need to toughen up. Another said judges are in the wrong profession if they experience secondary trauma. And remember, over 60%, just from this very study, had symptoms of secondary trauma. Others said secondary traumatic stress is a product of society's quote-unquote victim mentality. We know that it's a problem, whether we want to face it or not, and obviously you can see from the comments that people in the courtroom are not always willing to face it. We know that anger, this sort of repeated effect of listening to traumatic events and not being able to deal with it can lead to anger, other type of emotions, avoidance, as you saw in those comments. We know when we're angry that we tend to lose our peripheral vision. We're not, able to focus on what's going on in the courtroom. And I have down there the Commission on Judicial Conduct, and certainly, and I think I saw Shauna Willig among the people here, she was the executive director when I was there, and a lot of the judges we saw before the commission, I think she would agree, waited too long. And this sort of trauma that they repeatedly saw in their courtroom led them to act in ways that forced them to be in a place they didn't want to be in front of the commission. What are the barriers? And this is, the past year I worked with the Texas Lawyers Assistance Program, which provides actually a dedicated helpline to judges, a line that is rarely used. I think they told me they receive more calls on that line from, wrong numbers than judges reaching out. Judges just do not, seek out help. And there's numerous reasons this past year. I think I saw Thea here as well, walking around. Thea and I talked to all the JPs this year about this, and we heard about numerous barriers to self-help. Judges feel they're supposed to be perfect. We feel, we're the ones that people come into the courtroom and, people need to look up to. I remember when I was on the commission, there was a JP that said he was arrested numerous times for public intoxication. I think DWI. He tried to bond himself out, in fact, and he gave an interesting answer. He said, "Well, the reason why it's good that I got into all this trouble is I can empathize with my defendants by being arrested and committing these crimes." That didn't go well with the commission, and that's usually not the way our society looks at judges. Judges feel there's peer pressure, and they're afraid to reach out and seek help. And there is a sense of vulnerability if they reach out. So what sort of solutions can we look to better be able to handle the stress of secondary trauma that we see in our courtroom? What are some solutions? And what I like, and the U.S. Army created a number of these solutions, and these are solutions that I've seen. If you look, there is a growing literature involved in involved in looking at our courts and secondary trauma amongst not just judges but court personnel. And the commonality is, how can we build resiliency? In other words, how can we not just avoid the trauma? How can we not just build a wall between us and the trauma, but actually take in and focus in on that trauma and be our best selves in the courtroom, but also bounce back and be better? So I like that resiliency. And I haven't gone, in the brief time I have, right now, we're seeing immigration courts, certainly mental health cases, child custody. These are the areas where we're definitely seeing signs of secondary trauma. And, you know, the immigration courts, well before 2016, were suffering directly from this. But it's all of us in all of our courtrooms can pray to this. So what can we do? One of the ways, I'm going to go through three things and then talk about how we can use this in the courtroom, but I have this word optimism, and as we think about optimism, that makes sense, right? If you're optimistic, you'll feel better, and maybe you can do a better job, and maybe life will be better. But, it's difficult when you're thinking about the future always to be optimistic. And so what I like when we're talking about optimism is actually gratitude. There's been studies that show that if you go back and write a few sentences, and I know Thea did a great job in talking about this, you actually just every day or every other day, but you actually write down a sentence on what you're grateful about, that actually has a very positive effect on you. I know on myself, every year I have to write a memo to my city council to explain what I've been doing the past year, what goes on at court, and I don't look forward to that because you're talking to individuals. Some have a lot of experience, some don't. None of them are in the courtroom. It's just not something I really look forward to because it's a strange piece of writing. But when I'm done with it, and I've talked about some of the positive things that we have done in court, that actually does change my mindset towards court. It actually has a positive effect on me, a changing effect on me in terms of the way I look at things at court. And there's evidence that sort of gratitude can change our mindset. Finding connections. Going to a conference like this in which you're talking to numerous people in a variety of ways are dealing with mental health issues in our courtrooms, in our jails, in our society. Actually getting connections can make a big difference, and it's important. And with the phones and the cell phones and other ways for us to avoid connecting with each other, that definitely helps. Finally, mindfulness. Mindfulness is, and I'm going to read to you from a judge talking about it that I think illustrates how mindfulness can really help us. But it's the type of thing. First of all, what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is, you don't have to go to a silent weekend retreat, a yoga retreat, or go away for a week in silence to practice mindfulness. Mindfulness is actually just thinking about the present in a non-judgmental way. And mindfulness, it's easier said than done. A lot of times you'll think of people being mindful by taking 5 minutes and just focusing on their breath, because hopefully all of us are breathing in the present. And by focusing on your breath, you're emptying your mind. You're not thinking about what you're going to do tonight or what happened yesterday, but you're just focusing on something in the present. And if you try doing that, I challenge you to try that maybe later today. You'll find that it's very difficult. Before you know it, thoughts enter your mind, and the goal of mindfulness is to try to empty our mind for that brief period of time. And what you'll find, though, if you do that quite a bit, you will find that can actually help you be refreshed. And from my personal perspective, I find that it allows me in a stressful situation to just immediately be able to go to it. But it takes practice. It takes work to do that. I like this quote from Mark Twain. I've been through some terrible things in life. Some of them happened. And since I'm from College Station, I'll give you a George H. Bush line that I think is similar. I have opinions of my own, strong opinions, but I don't always agree with them. And what I think both of those quotes get to is there's a lot going on in our heads. And usually what's going on in our heads is not necessarily the reality, but it is the reality we live in. And so that's, I appreciate this half hour talking about this, because we spend so many time, especially the best of us, so devoted to the difficult issues outside of us in our courtroom or what's coming up that we don't think about self-care, or we don't even notice sometimes the effect that it has on us until, it seems to be too late. The idea of thinking about the present moment, like many of these ideas, is fairly simple, but you have to work on it. It takes practice. And certainly if you've been to an airport and you leave the plane, besides looking for the restroom, the first thing you look to is where's baggage claim. And it seems to mysteriously take you out of the airport and away you go. And it's not till, you come back to the airport and you have to sit there for 2 or 3 hours that you start actually noticing the airport. And that's sort of what I'm talking about looking at the present moment and doing this work. If we work hard on this, we can increase that difference between the stimulus and the response. And certainly for those judges and those who get in trouble in the courtroom or in the jail or wherever we're working with our defendants, a lot of times it's because of that impulse, that we very quickly go and rush to whatever comes into our mind at the time, and we're not actually being mindful, we're being mindless. The judge I wanted to read, this is Chief Justice Stephen Breyer, and the reason I'm going to read just briefly what he does every day is because when you do look into this, there's quite a few judges who practice some form of what he discusses. And even during the year, talking to municipal court judges, JPs, and other judges, many express different ways that they deal with stress. But this is what he had to say. I don't know what I do is meditation, or even whether it has a name. For 10 or 15 minutes, twice a day, I sit peacefully. I relax and think about nothing or as little as possible. And that is what I've done for a couple of years. And really, I started because it's good for my health. My wife said that this would be good for your blood pressure, and she was right. It really works. I read once that the practice of law is like attempting to drink water from a fire hose. And I think many of us would agree that that is, maybe we don't agree with Stephen Breyer and everything, but we would agree with that sentence, that the practice of law is like drinking water from a fire hose. And if you are under stress, meditation, or whatever you choose to call it, helps. Very often I find myself in circumstances that may be considered stressful, say in oral arguments where I have to concentrate very hard for an extended period. If I come back at lunchtime, I sit for 15 minutes and perhaps another 15 minutes later. Doing this makes me feel more peaceful, focused, and better able to do my work. And this is, what Justice Breyer had to say, and trust me, all of us, we've got our phones, which it's sort of the opposite of being mindful. It causes us to immediately look to what's in the past, what's in the future, and not practice on what we're doing in the present. So there's a lot of competing factors. We don't know what's going on in our society, but we do know that anxiety, depression, mental health issues are not just out there with our defendants, but they are out there amongst ourselves as well, especially with those that deal with difficult cases such as mental health defendants. So how can we work with this in our courtroom? And so the best thing that I could think about in reading about this was to think about when we're taking a plea or at some point when a defendant is in front of us, what can we do to work on being mindful? Mindful speaking and listening involves awareness that is open-hearted, centered in the present moment, and non-judgmental. The non-judgmental is the tough part. It's very tough to be non-judgmental if you're not focusing on the present and thinking and looking at a person for the first time. And this is sort of the opposite of what we do when we go to seminars. At seminars, we're learning new rules, we're talking about new ideas, and the more law we actually know, the more inflexible we often do become. There's been numerous studies on that the more that you know about something, you actually become more inflexible. And I think all of us know, we can remember our first day in our job, whatever job that is, we probably were more mindful and observant that day than we are last week or 2 weeks ago when we're kind of used to what we're doing. It's really difficult. So how do we mindfully listen? One, we actively attempt to understand the other's point of view, something that probably we spend more time with those defendants with mental health issues and feel at times that it's the most frustrating, but actively attempting to understand their point of view. Very difficult at times. Take in information without passing judgment. Acknowledging the speaker. Model empathic practices. And again, we know with empathy, with compassion, that can cause compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. So being able to work on that empathy, but keeping it there at the present moment, not trying to carry it on with us afterwards, and creating a trusting environment. Things not to do when we're trying to be mindful and listening in our courts or in the jail or wherever we are. Not changing the subject, not discounting the speaker's feelings. Let the speaker hook you into an emotional exchange. That happens a lot. That happens in our municipal and JP courts a lot of times. They'll mention the fines. I remember one person screamed at me in jail that I just eat steak every night with all the fines that our citizens pay, so that she's never going to pay anything. And you know, that's an emotional hook, right? People will try to use what's going on in their life to hook us and get us angry. Don't interrupt. Try not to give advice. Don't interrogate. So these are ways that we can work at being mindful at the time. And it's so difficult, but it's something that's worthwhile. In the final couple minutes, I'll give some resources, but the value of being mindful in our work is not just to avoid burnout, but it's actually to expand the choices and the thoughtfulness that we have when we're actually in the court. I know that I've changed quite a bit as a judge in the last 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. And you know, that's scary. We don't want to change. We want to just kind of build like a snowman. But we actually, we need to change. And the good type of change is when we've expanded our mind and been strong enough to think about all the different alternatives before us. The paradox of all of this is that the harder, the more trivial it is. I saw this on an Amazon review. Trivial to explain, difficult to accomplish. The more you need, the harder to achieve. This is difficult. It's difficult for all of us in this area. But every time I look at studies that are being done on not just judges, but lawyers who work with defendants in very, not just in mental health issues, but child abuse and other very difficult issues, I see that there's a problem, and a growing problem. And certainly when we look at our profession as a whole, there's a growing problem. There's numerous resources out there. The Texas Lawyers Assistance Program is out there for anyone, including non-lawyers. They will work with non-lawyers. They're anonymous, and they're there to help all of us. To end my 30 minutes, and I promised I would be just 30 minutes, and I think I've hit the mark on that, is just to add that I really do believe that if we are more mindful, if we can work on being more mindful, I think we can better serve the defendants that come before us. The beauty and value of this summit is that we're all working hard to help a particular type of defendant. And we know that courts that focus on specialty courts work. These sort of programs work. And what's wonderful about today and tomorrow is, people are talking with each other about various ways to, things that work with the most difficult of our defendants. But I do think it's important also to exercise self-care, look to ourselves, and if we can do that, I think we'll be not only better than ourselves right now, but will benefit everyone in our courtrooms and our society in general. Thank you very much. Thank you.